Are we working? So basically, I don't know what to fucking rant about. So we're doing a little reaction video. It's actually my first reaction video. So bear with me and let's get started.
Let's start with the
Oh
bad
yeah, we're watching the worst punishments in human history. I should have said that. All right,
and
now let's get
slowly work
started.
our way towards the stuff of nightmares. Number 10, the Rat Dungeon. If you were alive
Ew.
in London, England during the medieval period, you would have definitely heard about the Rat Dungeon, since this punishment struck paralyzing fear into the hearts of even the most hardened criminals. This was a cell located at the bottom of the London Tower, where prisoners were shackled and chained. The dungeon was connected to the nearby river just below the river's waterline, so that when the water levels rose, all the rats that lived along the riverbed would be forced to swim downstream. The hungry and angry rats towards the entrance of the dungeon, where they would then come face to face with the prisoner. The unlucky prisoner, he never actually saw anything, or the soft scurries of the rat's feet entering the dungeon. And in a matter of minutes, these soft noises were in the hundreds around him. Angry rats would then begin to take small bites. Now he might be able to shake the rats off for a few hours, but eventually the prisoner would pass out from pure exhaustion. And while he slept, the rats would continue to take bites from his flesh. Eventually,
Ew,
when he
bro.
would wake up, he would discover hundreds of bites throughout his entire body. The prisoner was left here for days or weeks on end, depending on his crime. But
Ew,
towards
look at
the end of
him.
the medieval period, this form of punishment just got more and more deranged.
Okay.
Execution, where prisoners would just be thrown in the dungeon and forgotten about.
Why were they so creative with their punishments? That's something I realized.
The rack was a torture device that was used in many places throughout history. It was originally designed for getting a confession, usually from criminals. In England in 1447, a 25-year-old girl named Anne Askew was tortured on the rack for hours while her joints were dislocated. She was carried on a chair and burned alive at the stake because she read and memorized scriptures from the Bible, which she preached in private to a small group of women. With number 8. Keel hauling. This brutal punishment was carried out at sea on sailors who would steal or be violent towards others and would usually result in death.
Like, what is this? They're so creative with the way they draw their shit too.
Rope, then looped around the entire circumference of the ship before being tied off to his feet. The sailor would then be thrown overboard while the group of men on board pulled on the rope to slowly drag him around the outside of the ship, including over the keel, which is how this punishment gets its name. The sailor wouldn't even have to worry about it, since they were dead before they ever reached it. It just depends on how hard the guys on the rope feel like working that day. Not only would the sailors be drowning and getting their backs and necks broken on the keel, they were also getting sliced apart like a cheese grater by all the sharp barnacles on the outside of the ship. But if by some miracle a sailor actually happens to make it all the way around the ship without dying, one of 3 things will happen. 1. He would be sent for round 2, and for sure be dead by then. 2. Be freed and allowed back on the ship, where he would then slowly die to infections. Or 3. Live the rest of his life single and being made fun of, since he was now fully covered in scars from head to toe. Number 7.
I had never heard of that. That is
Now we are getting to the part of the list where living is no longer an option. This form of punishment has been used by many countries throughout history, but was most recently used by India in the 19th century, which is really not that long ago if you really think about it. What type of crimes would you have to commit to be crushed by an elephant, you might ask? Well, apparently if you fail to pay your taxes. That was, and of course,
I do tax evasion.
Disturbing case in history was when the 4th Mughal Emperor of India ordered an enormous amount of criminals to be crushed to death in a single day, simply because he was bored and needed some entertainment. The guy who forgot to pay his taxes, crushed. The man who stole an apple from the local market, crushed. The man who murdered his neighbor and added his remains to a large pot of tomato soup, then fed that soup to his family and watched them eat it from the shadows with a creepy smirk on his face. There are a few ways that this public execution goes down, but one thing always stays the same. There's always a guy on top of the elephant controlling its every move. And this was very intentional, as this was meant to showcase just how amazing the ruling class were. I mean, look at them. They can control an elephant. Now be impressed.
Hey, now get your head.
The criminals would have their arms tied behind their back and their heads placed on a pedestal, where it was then crushed like a grape by the elephant's foot. Now the criminal would be placed flat on the floor with their arms tied behind their backs. Then the elephants would be guided to walk over the person's body, and hopefully the criminal would die on the first go. But sometimes they crushing a leg or an arm, then has to make a U-turn and try again. slowly crush the person limb by limb. First crush the arms, then the legs, and then poke holes in them with the tusk until giving the final blow to the head or torso. This is a theatrical route that rulers like the Fourth Mughal loved and made for a truly traumatizing experience. This has been used by a few countries throughout history, but was most recently used in Egypt in the 17th, usually against criminals that were highway robbers, grave thieves, or anyone who would try and start a rebellion. This criminal lay flat on their stomachs with their arms tied behind their back and thrust in a long wooden stake sharply tapered on one end. The stake was greased up beforehand to make this process a lot smoother.
Ooh.
Head or mouth, they were pretty much long gone. He is then planted next to a busy road, like a Halloween decoration.
What is my
remind
country
everyone that This is what
doing?
happens when you break the law.
I'm not a
But
part of
wait,
this.
there's another version of this as
I
well.
was
You see,
not
on
a
some
part of this
occasions, the
shit. What
criminals
the
would
fuck?
only be impaled just deep enough to keep them in place, but not too deep that it would cause immediate death.
What
They
the
would do this
fuck?
by having
So they're
stakes
just
that
having
had
a pleasure
seated
game until the
position on
next
them
second they
to
just
prevent
feel
the person from
an
sliding down any further. They would then
excruciating
be
pain come
placed
out
on
their
a
mouth.
They would suffer for hours and hours, pleading to people walking by for help until eventually succumbing to their wounds. Number 5. Poena Culae. Poena Culae is Latin for
That shit
penalty of the
disgusted me.
sack, and that's exactly what it was, just a lot more terrifying and cruel. This was an exclusive punishment for anyone that would murder their own family members.
Is that a fucking
This
scythe?
was first seen in the 2nd century in Rome, but would later be used by the Germans in the 18th century. This all began
Because
with
the Germans try to be
murderer
like
being
Rome with
placed
that
thick
fuck
leather
ass
bag.
name, the Holy
But just
Roman
to make sure
Empire.
the man isn't lonely, they would then add a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. I don't know what these animals did to deserve this, but hey, at least the evil family murderer doesn't die alone. Once all the animals are added inside the bag, it is then sewn shut, creating an almost airtight seal. Now you would think this would be horrible.
Are you gonna
enough,
like set them
but
on
no,
fire?
This is just the beginning, because as soon as the bag is sewn shut, it is then tossed into the ocean. Later on, these murderers would be given the option to either be placed inside the leather bag or be sent to perform at the Colosseum, where they can perform the act of being mauled to death in front of all of their loved ones and peers. You know, at least they had the option. Number 4. Rats. This is one of the most sick punishments in all of human history, and it involves the use of rats. A rat inside of a clay bowl, then placing it topside down on a prisoner's stomach, chest, face, or groin. And the back of the bowl would be heated with either a torch or some coals, causing the rat to go into a full-on panic. In England, this was used on traitors, murderers, pirates, and thieves. But after the year 1752, the Murder Act was passed, which required that all convicted murderers must be put to death by being publicly dissected or by gibbeting of some sort. And over 134 confirmed people met this fate. The most common form of gibbeting were actually cages. They were then hung 30 feet or more off, usually on a public road or water. But the annoyance and torture of the public didn't stop there, because after the criminals would die in the cages, the body would be left inside to rot for years, with the locals complaining that the smell of death was so pungent that they couldn't even sleep at night. There's even been reports that some human remains stayed inside of these cages for over 20 years before a government official would finally remember to clean it out. Number 2. This was
What the fuck did I just see? And it's just that. That's how you
Number 2.
introduced me to that. Is that supposed to be their fucking stomach? Ew, bro.
This was a form of punishment that was used by the ancient Persian Empire on anyone that would be convicted of murder. First, the criminal would be placed inside of a boat on their backs and tied down. The boat had 4 holes cut out so that the person's arms and legs would be outside of the boat and in the water. They were then force-fed large quantities of honey and milk until their stomachs were visibly full. They would then proceed to lather their entire body with the milk and honey as well. After all these steps were completed, he was then pushed out to the middle of the lake, where he was completely exposed to the heat of the sun. But the sun would soon become the least of his worries. You see, the reason they fed him milk and honey was not because it was a great last meal, but because this combination causes the person to get extreme diarrhea, which mixed with the sweet honey attracts rodents, bugs, wasps, bees, flies, and whatever other animals live near the lake. After being tormented by the
Ew,
animals
bro.
throughout the entire night, you would think that the daytime maybe gets a little better. Because as soon as the sun rises the following day, the person inside of the boat gets another gigantic meal of milk and honey and an additional
Oh, so he comes back. They come back to him. They give him a second dose. They just look at the mess. They analyze the mess. And they're like, all right, let's keep it going.
This would be
Okay.
done on a daily basis to prolong the punishment for as long as possible. It was also well documented that the rodents would continuously attempt to burrow inside of the person. They were probably trying to get a head start on their next meal. A writer named John Sonaris wrote in great detail
Like a
about
fucking
one of these
parasite.
incidents. He would go on to say that it was one of the most horrid and cruel forms of punishment since it was terribly long and seemed to have no end in sight. He wrote about a man who survived for an entire 17 days before he finally died from his wounds. Apparently, the man spent his last few days with his entire face completely covered with wasps, and
Oh,
his
hell
flesh
no.
rotting away, filled with swarms of parasites and
Ew,
worms,
bro. That's
all while
actually
being covered
nasty
in
as
his own
shit.
filth. Number 1. The oubliette. Oubliette simply means to forget in French. This was a punishment that was used in many places throughout history. London Tower, which had a small and confined room called Little Ease. Not only was this room pitch black, it was also so small that prisoners could not sit, stand, or lay down while inside it, and they would be left in this uncomfortable position for days on end. One of the most famous oubliettes is not the one in the London Tower, but in the neighboring district of Warwick, inside of Warwick Castle. Deep underground in the castle's dungeons is a very small and narrow cell, completely made of stone, which has a metal door to close it shut. Prisoners were tossed inside of the cell and forgotten, as the name implies. The prisoner would just have to sit and wait for their inevitable death, which usually came in a few days from dehydration or starvation. As in reality, most of the time there would already be a rotting corpse inside of the cell, since the underground dungeons are completely infested with rats that have developed a taste for human flesh. These oubliettes existed in many of castles throughout Europe, and in recent times they have actually discovered these dungeons with dozens, if not hundreds, of human remains inside of it, as proof that they were hardly ever cleaned.
That's
Like
actually
in Leap
livid.
Castle of Ireland, where in 1900 a worker found a small opening behind a wall of the chapel. It was filled with so many skeletons that they needed multiple cartloads to clear it all out. Many stories of men who have been placed inside one of these dungeons and kept alive for
Like the Paris catacombs. Like, and how many men have died in the hands of like more powerful men. It really just puts like a perspective to like how lucky we are and shit. And also like on how much power these people held because they could just kill them.